Hi, my name is Nick Sanna, and I'm the president of the FAIR Institute. It is my honor to introduce the next session, whose title is A Strategic Approach to Defending the United States in Cyberspace. I'm very happy to highlight this moment of unity that we have witnessed on March 11th of this year, that unfortunately was overshadowed by the shutdowns that came into effect in the US due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Congressmen from different sides of the political spectrum, government and private industry experts came together as the Cyberspace Solarium Commission to collaborate and come up with a set of recommendations for the US to more effectively defend itself in cyberspace. The resulting report outlines recommendations for reforms to organize government more effectively, to promote international accountability, and to strengthen collaboration around cybersecurity between the private and public sectors. It is now my distinct honor to introduce the first of two key contributors to this effort, who are both commissioners of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Congressman Mark Gallagher, first elected in 2016, Congressman Mike Gallagher represents Wisconsin's 8th district in the US House of Representatives. Mike is a 7th generation Wisconsin native, born and raised in Green Bay. I think you can guess what NFL team he roots for. Congressman Gallagher joined the United States Marine Corps the day he graduated from college and served for 7 years on active duty as a counterintelligence/human intelligence officer and regional affairs officer for the Middle East and North Africa. He deployed twice to Iraq as a commander of intelligence teams, served on General Petraeus's Central Command Assessment Team in the Middle East, and worked for 3 years in the intelligence community. Prior to taking office, Mike worked in the private sector at a global energy and supply chain management company in Green Bay. After earning his bachelor's degree from Princeton University, Congressman Gallagher went on to earn a master's degree in security studies from Georgetown University, a second degree in strategic intelligence from National Intelligence University, and his PhD in international relations from Georgetown. Congressman Gallagher currently serves on the House Armed Services and Transportation and Infrastructure Committees. Feel free during the session to ask questions in the chat that's being moderated live. Congressman Gallagher, thank you. Thank you so much for making time to address FairCon 2020 and guiding us through the goals, hopes, and recommendations of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission.
Hey there, it's Congressman Mike Gallagher. Welcome to the first day of FairCon 2020. I wish I could be with you in person, although all of us are finding ways to survive in cyberspace in the midst of this pandemic. And so I think it makes the work that we've done on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission even more important. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the process of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and the outcome of that process, in the hopes that it will engage you in a debate on what's next for the Commission's work. First of all, the Commission was created by law in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, and it was created to recommend a strategic approach to protect the United States against a cyber incident of significant consequence. We had 14 commissioners, including 4 serving legislators, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, technically 1 independent, a Democrat, and 2 Republicans, 4 executive branch leaders, and 6 appointed members coming from business, academia, the think tank community, former high-level government officials. And we were really focused on a new strategic approach and the policy and legislative remedies to implement that approach. After working for over a year, our final report was issued on March 11th, 2020. You could say our timing was inauspicious because that was a couple days before the Capitol shut down due to coronavirus, but we marched ahead nonetheless in injecting our proposals into the legislative process. All of our work can be found on www.solarium.gov. You can download our strategy and our 80-plus recommendations, which include more than half of those have a legislative component. We've been doing a public rollout and an advocacy process. As a member of the Armed Services Committee, I'm trying to get as many of our recommendations into this year's National Defense Authorization Act as possible. And we had 5 congressional hearings through August. Really, if you read the report, you'll find that we tried to set the scene in terms of the challenge we have in cyberspace. And right now, we conclude as a commission that the deterrence is simply not working in the cyber domain. We have escalating nation-state and criminal cyber attacks on public and private sectors. We've had massive intellectual property theft from 2008 to 2016, denial of service attacks on our financial infrastructure, the OPM hack, interference in our national elections. We had the WannaCry global ransomware incident in April of 2017, the NotPetya disruption and destruction in June 2017, the growing trend of unchecked ransomware attacks throughout this past year. And so we really have a significant threat environment involving threat, disruption, destruction, and subversion. And our goal was to talk directly to the American people about that threat and hopefully wake up a lot of our colleagues about the nature of that threat. And that frames our new strategic approach to cybersecurity for the nation. What we're advocating for is a strategy that we call layered cyber deterrence, really built on 3 layers. In the first layer, we talk about shaping behavior internationally and nationally, building partnerships, leveraging our non-military instruments, turning ourselves into a better ally and a leader in cyberspace. In the second layer, we talk about denying benefits to our adversaries, whether it's through securing our elections better, protecting our critical infrastructure better, ensuring continuity of the economy. And in the third layer, we talk about imposing costs. How can we generate cyber capabilities and capacity to impose costs on our adversaries should they make the mistake of attacking us in cyberspace? And the end state of all of those layers is, our desired end state is to reduce the frequency and the severity of cyber attacks of significant consequence and limit the ability of great powers, rogue states, extremists, and criminals to undermine American power and influence. Now, all of those layers depend on a foundation of U.S. government reform. And we lay out about 6 pillars for how we go about implementing layered cyber deterrence. But pillar 1 is reforming the U.S. government structure and organization for cyberspace, doing things like creating a national cyber director. Pillar 2 is strengthening norms and non-military tools. I really want to dig into 3 pillars, pillars 3, 4, and 5, though, in the limited time I have right now. Pillar 3 is about promoting resilience. And I single this out because we are trying to improve the government's capacity to understand, assess, and manage national risk by, for example, resourcing and codifying the responsibilities of the various agencies within government, the sector-specific agencies that manage day-to-day engagement with the private sector, and tasking them in coordination with the Department of Homeland Security to establish a 5-year national risk management cycle and a critical infrastructure resilience strategy. We believe that with this plan, we can create a fuller picture of risk and prioritize our resources and assets accordingly. Within this resilience pillar, we also want to ensure that we have the national capacity to respond and to recover from a significant cyber incident. And this means developing a continuity of the economy plan to ensure continuous operation of the critical functions of the economy in the event of a significant cyber disruption. In much the same way we developed our continuity of operations and government plans in order to respond to a massive nuclear attack in the early parts of the old Cold War. This ability to respond and recover also depends on strengthening the U.S. government's ability to assist the private sector when a significant cyber incident occurs through what we call a cyber state of distress and the creation of a cyber response and recovery fund. And finally, under resilience, we want to ensure the security of elections and the resilience of our democracy by improving the funding and structure of the Election Assistance Commission and expanding overall digital literacy efforts. Pillar 4 is about reshaping the cyber ecosystem towards greater security. In particular, we want to improve the security of technology by providing more transparent and understandable information on the security of IT and OT goods and services through the creation of a national cybersecurity certification and labeling authority. We also want to improve the security behavior of users and organizations by, for example, creating a Bureau of Cyber Statistics or aligning incentives that businesses and users take cybersecurity seriously by reinvigorating the cybersecurity insurance market. We also want to leverage entities and organizations who can scale security across the ecosystem by identifying key ICT enablers and working with them to ensure a higher standard of security for their services. So for example, we talk about creating a cloud security certification that providers can voluntarily attest to, incentivizing the uptake of cloud services for state and local governments and small and medium-sized businesses, and then working with the major internet providers to ensure that core internet protocols are more secure. And finally, we talk a lot about managing the risks of increasingly complex and global supply chains by identifying, assessing, and filling gaps in our ICT dependencies through the development and operationalization of an ICT industrial-based strategy. Yes, I said it, the dirty word, industrial-based strategy. And then Pillar 5 is about operationalizing cybersecurity collaboration with the private sector. We recognize that the private sector is the main effort in cyber. It's where most of our critical infrastructure is owned and operated. And so the government really needs a mindset shift, and Congress needs to sort of incentivize the federal government to shift their mindset. And so we recommend enhancing government support to private sector operations by bringing to bear the government's unique authorities, resources, and intelligence capabilities. For example, we recommend codifying a new social contract between the government and systemically important critical infrastructure to recognize the unique resources, roles, and responsibilities that are necessary to protect critical systems and assets. We recommend creating a more formal process to identify private sector cybersecurity intelligence needs and priorities to enhance their cybersecurity operations. We talk about improving the combined situational awareness of cyber threats to better support the U.S. government and private sector cyber defensive efforts by creating a single joint collaborative environment to serve as the focal point for the sharing and fusing of all federal and critical infrastructure cyber threat information, insight, and other relevant data. And then finally, we talk about the need to bolster the U.S. government's capacity to better coordinate its own cyber defense planning and operations and integrate the government's operations with the private sector by resourcing and supporting an integrated cyber center within CISA that acts as the venue for public-private collaboration and that central coordinating body among different federal cyber centers and private sector partners, and establishing a joint cyber planning office at CISA to coordinate cybersecurity planning and readiness across the federal government and between the public and private sectors. So that's just a little bit of 3 of the 6 pillars that that support that overall strategy of layered cyber deterrence. But my hope is that you'll go on www.solarium.gov, download the report, read it, and provide us your feedback. We really want to engage all the smart people in the ecosystem in a productive conversation. We know that we are going to continue to wrestle with the best way to secure our nation in cyber for a long time to come. But we also know that deterrence right now is not working to stop our adversaries' actions in the gray zone, short of armed conflict. But the commission strongly believes, and we debated this for a long time, that deterrence can work. Now, it will differ from the old Cold War model of strategic deterrence by punishment, but there are useful lessons we can take and ideas that we can modernize and apply to the cyber domain. In particular, we believe that defense and resilience is a meaningful differentiator in cyberspace. And for years, we have been delinquent in investing in meaningful defense and resilience. And we also believe that public-private partnership, while I know that word gets thrown around a lot, is absolutely crucial. And where the vast majority of cyberspace and our critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector, we need a more productive relationship between the federal government and the private sector. And so the Cyberspace Solarium Commission's work was just one effort to get there. We really hope that you'll engage with the final report. We were lucky to have the cooperation of the executive branch, the legislative branch, and truly amazing people in the private sector. And so I want to thank you for being part of FairCon. I want to thank you for engaging with our report, and thank you for listening to me talk about a little bit of what's in the Cyberspace Solarium Commission final report. And I look forward to hearing from you soon.
Congressman Gallagher, on behalf of the FAIR Institute community, we want to thank you for such a passionate explanation of the mission and goals of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission that I'm sure our members will get more familiar with and support. I now have the distinct honor to introduce our second speaker, who is also a member of the Commission, Chris Inglis. Chris Inglis is a former Deputy Director at the National Security Agency, where he served from 2006 to 2014. He's a retired Brigadier General of the United States Air Force. He also led for 5 years the intelligence panel for the US Strategic Command's Strategic Advisory Group. Chris is currently serving as the Looker Distinguished Visiting Professor of Cyber Studies at the United States Naval Academy and sits on the board of directors of FedEx and Huntington Bank. Chris is a managing director of Paladin Capital Group, a member of the US Defense Science Board, and a trustee for the National Intelligence University. I would also call him a friend and key contributor to the FAIR Institute. Welcome, Chris. Chris, you had the fortune to collaborate with many other distinguished commissioners, but you're also quite familiar with FAIR. So, and I remember the first time that we had a conversation about FAIR a few years ago, and how you were recounting about reading the FAIR book on a trip over to the West Coast, and immediately understood its underpinnings and its value for improving current risk management practices. So with that in mind, I want to ask you on behalf of the FAIR Institute community, what aspects and recommendations of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission report are most relevant for the risk management space?
Yeah, so thanks, Nick, and thanks for an opportunity to participate in another FairCon. I'll miss the opportunity to meet everyone face to face. It's those conversations in the corners, which are so let's host a glass to a toast that we can do that in 2021. That being said, it's a great question. I'll take the first implicit question and then go straight to the direct question. It was a privilege to participate on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, as Congressman Gallagher indicated. It was nonpartisan and diverse in every way that matters. You could not tell who was affiliated with what ideology as you walked into the room of the commissioners. The only moment of tension was when we discovered that Congressman Gallagher's team, the Green Bay Packers, had gotten into the NFL playoffs, but we worked our way through that. But otherwise, I think everyone brought their best game to the table and tried to make sure that the diversity in the room was not there to defend the stovepipes that were outside the room, but rather to contribute to the solution of a problem that faced the nation. So we brought our power to solve a common problem. In that regard, I'll just reprise a little bit of what Congressman Gallagher said, because I think that goes directly to the question you've asked. We propose that we can make a difference. We can deter both significant and all other action in this space of a negative sort by essentially doing three things. One, let's establish roles, responsibilities, let's establish the norms, let's establish what ordinary normal looks like in terms of behaviors in cyberspace. That's essentially reshaping the ecosystem. Two, let's build in natural resilience and robustness such that if an adversary wants to come at one of us or all of us in that space, they have a harder time of it. They have to bear a higher cost. And three, if in fact the adversaries, the miscreants, the criminals in this space ignore the standards that we've established, they essentially ignore the inherent resilience and robustness. The third part is we will impose costs on them. all of that kind of effects a collaboration of all the instruments of power that our society can bring to bear. It's not simply a proposal for a US national strategy, but for a strategy that works in the international domain. And the proposal kind of at the bottom line is we propose that if an adversary wants to come after one of us in that space, they have to beat all of us. That's essentially a call for collaboration. That's a call for proactivity, that we essentially get ready and we crowdsource adversaries in the way they've crowdsourced for us. Coming around to your question, all of that must stand on a foundation of knowledge. Knowledge with some clarity and crispness about the nature of the threats in that space. Knowledge with some clarity, crispness, and shareability about the risks in that space. And the FAIR framework comes into view at that point of being an excellent way to not simply qualify what those risks are, but to quantify those risks in a way that's repeatable, time after time after time. So when you kind of want to share your sense as to how you prioritize what you're going to work on, so that your collaborators in that space can essentially kind of share that prioritization and work accordingly, you want something that you can quantify in a repeatable manner. Such that it's not scripted arbitrarily from 1 to n. It's based upon sound data. And you also want a sense as to, if I attack this facet of the problem, what's the consequence? What do I get in return for that? Again, that foundation of knowledge is essential to any strategy, but in particular, this strategy, which proposes collaboration in the application of a unified effort. Congressman Gallagher spoke about 6 pillars. You might consider those to be chapter headings in the report. The 2 that come foremost to mind with respect to this conference are Pillar 3, which is promote national resilience, which is how do we actually characterize what national risk is? How do we share the responsibility for that across all stakeholders, individuals, organizations, governments? And then Pillar 4, which is then based upon that knowledge, let's reshape the ecosystem so that we have a bias towards inherent resilience and robustness. Again, it stands on that common foundation of knowledge. So it's a great question. I think that perhaps you might say that the strategy is caught up to FAIRCon. It's now ready and willing and needing to embrace what the FAIR framework offers. So I think that your work is going to be extremely valuable to all of the stakeholders who will embrace these recommendations, which are shared by many other bodies as well as we go forward.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to see that the recommendations are very much in line with principles that the FAIR Institute has been advocating for years. There is a need to speak about risk in cyberspace in a way that makes sense. We often hear in a profession a lot of talk about risk in terms of vulnerabilities without full context of the value of the assets these vulnerabilities are associated with, and the severity of the threats. It's great to see, in the Commission's report, the call for better cyber risk models. And another aspect that really piqued my interest is what the Commission says about regulatory bodies, and more specifically about the SEC, and how they can help in supporting, the right behavior by regulated entities in doing the right things that can help the US's resilience to cyber events. Can you please tell us more about the nature of those recommendations and what their desired effectives?
Yeah, there are some recommendations. Overall, there are 82 recommendations. By and large, they are biased towards using market forces, incentives, to create the conditions we think are necessary. But when necessary, they do, in fact, use regulations or the imposition, the codification of rules, right, to effect that. With respect to the regulators, we therefore come at that both ways. I think that the best regulators, like the best pilots, don't so much help to come in and clean up the mess on aisle 9. They don't get out of any scrape, they avoid them in the first place. Right? And so the best regulators levy very clear expectations up front about what the expectations are of your quantification of risk, your marriage of that risk to attendant actions to deal with that risk. There isn't a formula up front that says, how much risk you should accept, but there should be a requirement, especially if you're a publicly traded entity, that you are aware of that risk and you are dealing with that risk according to your own circumstances and your risk appetite. that needs to be declared. So the regulators need to explicitly declare that that's the expectation, that you understand cyber risk as a component of your operational readiness to engage your markets and to serve your shareholders. There is a recommendation in the file that then says that the SEC should codify what is a 2018 interpretation of the Sarbanes-Oxley requirement that says include cyber as a mandatory component of that. That might not be the most popular recommendation ever, but when we talk to the private sector, over 300 different engagements, just about every one of them said it makes sense. I'm not sure that I want to be told to do that, but it does make sense, and to the degree that you normalize that and make that a consistent expectation across all companies, all sectors, it would be helpful. But I think regulators also need to ensure that ahead of any event, any storm, any crisis, that they're not simply levying those expectations, but they're helping to convey what best practices might look like. They're working with the other parts of government who might provide information about threats that are uniquely held by the government. Think about intelligence assets that the government has that are uniquely authorized to go over the near or far horizon and determine what's happening out there, and to then be able to share that proactively with the private sector, multiple private sectors, not just this nation, but like-minded nations, to ensure that they're ready to deal with those threats. If you marry those threats with a quantification of risk, then you're in the best possible situation, married with a clear expectation of what your responsibility is, to essentially create the resilience and robustness called for by the Solarium Commission, but frankly called by any sensible person, in my view, who's looked at this problem. We cannot simply react and expect that that's going to solve all these problems. We need to prepare. We need to invest in resilience and robustness. And if we do that, we'll have a reasonable expectation that miscreants, adversaries in this space, again, are going to have to be all of us to be one of us. That's the magic here.
There is a question in the chat that asks, how have these recommendations been received so far? Chris?
Generally positive. There are 82 recommendations. They haven't all been picked up, by crowds that are carrying kind of banners and torches and running to daylight. So I would say about a third of those recommendations are currently in play, meaning that they're in the place, whether that's the legislative or the executive branch, that would then do something with them that would say, we'll try to take them to execution. About half of those recommendations do require some legislative clarity, either to relieve a liability or to assign a specific role, to permit a government entity to have a more direct relationship, a positive, proactive relationship with the private sector. And of those, kind of roughly about 47 of the 82 recommendations that require legislative relief, about half of those are actually in the current version of the National Defense Authorization Act, which hasn't been concluded as we kind of speak at this conference. It's going to what's called a conference, where the House and the Senate kind of reconcile their differences of opinion. I think that bodes well. The commission's also been extended. It was supposed to essentially achieve its useful end of life this year, calendar year 2020. It's been extended through August 2021, so that we can then reach to some useful conclusion. What I found most perhaps welcome was that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has supported what I believe is a leading recommendation. They're all important in my view, but a leading recommendation, which is to urge the government to create, once again, a cyber coordinator. We call it a National Cyber Director at the White House, with White House nomination, executive branch nomination, and Senate approval. We think that that will help create the coherence and the forward motion, the proactive forward motion, joined up kind of all instruments of power, government collaboration with the private sector. Because what we heard over and over again from the private sector was that one of the first problems that they wanted us to address was, how do you actually create coherence in the federal enterprise? There are various instruments of power that the federal government wields. Some of those are kind of punitive, some of those are additive, some of those are simply observing. But when the private sector shows up, they want to know that those are all joined up in a very proactive, collaborative way with the private sector, that we use market forces as a bias and only use those regulatory or compliance or punitive measures when it's necessary by exception. That, I think, requires top-down leadership. So Chamber of Commerce has kind of seconded that. I think that that has a reasonable chance of success this year. Again, kind of motivating the rest of the federal government to be proactive, to essentially be collaborative with the private sector, and to do that on a foundation, right, of real data, real knowledge about what the nature of the ecosystem is. I'm optimistic, perhaps more optimistic than I might have been a year ago, at a time when it was simply just hard to get the attention of the matting public, let alone some kind of bias for action.
Thank you. That's really refreshing to hear. You know, one of the questions that are being posed is, what can each member of the Fair Institute, in the context of their organizations, or even as a private citizen, do to help follow the Commission's recommendations? Do you have any recommendations for our members?
Yeah, so I would say several things. First, have faith, right, that the rest of the world's going to catch up to you, right? I think that everyone at this conference has more than a passing interest in creating resilience and robustness based on real data. I mean, that's the premise of why we get together, to share insights about how to effect and advance those best practices. Have faith that the rest of the world is catching up to you. Solarium Commission, I think, has caught up to you and tried to then add a body of recommendations to support the work that you're doing. Perhaps exceeding kind of what the FAIR framework would recommend, but complementing that, I think, in a very nice way. The second is if you have that faith, then understand that whether it's by compulsion or by self-inspiration or by perhaps an expectation rendered by the shareholders, your companies and your organizations will one day turn to you and say, can you tell me something about the nature of the risks that we face? Can you quantify those? Because we can't defend ourselves against all perils. We can't defend all the assets with equal fervor as much as we would like to. We have to rank order that. And once we've done that, can you help me figure out, if I make an investment of $1 against, you pick the topic, can I have some meaningful expectation of what I'm going to get for that? Not a finger in the wind, which says that I think it's blowing kind of hard or kind of light, but something more specific than that. Be prepared to do that. Institutionalize the repeatable scientific process that you've had as a basis for that kind of concerted collaborative action. And then finally, I would say, expect more of government. Now, many of you who have perhaps knocked on that door time and time again have gone away saying, you know, there's no hope and it simply won't change. But I think you need to increase your expectations, perhaps increase the pitch of your voice. Because I think that what the Solarium Commission and others have recommended is that while the private sector operates 85–90% of this, and that's where most of the innovation like this framework come from, the private sector, the government still retains unique instruments of power that must be added, right, to that collaboration in order to make the difference against adversaries who increasingly have the edge in choosing the time and the place that they engage us. In running across our supposed jurisdictional boundaries, there aren't really many boundaries in cyberspace, the technical realm of cyberspace. And so we need to make sure that government is a full and committed partner in that, and accept nothing less than a fully committed, fully collaborative, fully proactive government that on occasion may impose regulation or compliance regimes, but hopefully the vast majority of the time is simply doing those market incentives, those positive biases to assist you ahead of the need in ways that you need to be, must be assisted.
Thank you, Chris. What I really like about your comment is that you have expanded our thinking, and how we understand our roles in the process of improving the nation's resiliency to cyber events in very concrete terms, not big speech, very concrete, pragmatic terms. We at the Fair Institute are really very grateful for the concrete and pragmatic nature of the Commission's recommendations and feel like we're fighting the same battle. I also want to thank you personally because you're one of my role models for what it means to be a public servant. And I mean that in the most noble way, You continue to put your expertise at the service, of the nation and the common good. To our listeners, I recommend that you read the report of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission to get more familiar with it and help build a more resilient future for the nation. Chris, do you have any final comments for our members?
I would just say that if you're interested in a good read, the document's got plenty of white space, and so it's actually an easy read. But there's an executive version of the document as well at the solarium.gov site. And we've also added white papers on cyber education, on the lessons from the pandemic, and very soon on some lessons about how do we make our supply chain more resilient and robust. And so do go after that. And then I would just close with, I'm confident about two things. One is that your final commendation of what I may or may not have done is overly generous, and so I'll work harder to perhaps kind of live into that aspiration. But two, that the FAIR Institute has made and will continue to make a significant contribution to this body of work. Again, I think that everything we propose is based upon a foundation of knowledge, repeatable, scientific, demonstrably kind of justified knowledge. And you have led the way in that regard. So thank you most of all for that.
Thank you, Chris. You have been as informative and insightful as ever. We look forward to continue journeying together towards a more resilient future in cyberspace.